Hi, and welcome to segment 3 of 5 recorded lectures on the nervous system. In this lecture, we will cover the lecture slides, part 2 of 2, and it's slide number 1 through 56, and this is segment 3 of 5. In this segment, we'll cover topics 1, 2, and 3, reflex arcs. We'll review the somatic and the autonomic nervous system, and then we'll take a deep dive into the autonomic nervous system. When we start to talk about reflex arcs, we'll start by talking more about how neurons communicate in sequence, and that communication will extend beyond the nervous system to include various types of effectors. In this third segment, I don't think we'll get to cover too many of these fascinating topics, so you'll just have to wait until we can get to them in segment 4 and 5. So reflex arcs. A reflex is a fast, involuntary set of actions that occur in response to a specific stimulus. So here's an example. What would happen if you accidentally grab this hot pan? You know what would happen because you've done something similar in the past. You would immediately let go of that hot pan. There would be pain in your hand. There might be some dancing around and some swearing, and you would back away from the barbecue. So a reflex arc is a sequence of events that occurs in response to a particular stimulus. So there's the stimulus, grabbing a hot pan, and that gives rise to sensory input from the temperature receptors that are present in your skin. And that sensory input travels along afferent neurons toward the central nervous system, where integration occurs. And in this case, the integrative function of the nervous system determines that action is required. And so that central nervous system gives rise to motor output that travels toward effectors along efferent or motor neurons. And in this case, the effector is skeletal muscle, and those skeletal muscles will cause extension of the hand, extension of the fingers, and you will drop the pan. So a reflex arc refers to the specific pathway that nerve impulses travel to produce or result in the response. So any reflex arc has 5 components. There is one or more sensory receptor that monitors a condition and generates signals. There is one or more sensory neuron that transmit these signals from the sensory receptor toward the central nervous system, or the integration center is component number 3. The integration center combines, analyzes the sensory input, and then, if necessary, gives rise to motor output. That motor output will travel along efferent neurons, also known as motor neurons, and then signal an effector. And the effector brings about the response, what we think of as the reflexive response. So we can use this picture to illustrate the 5 components of a reflex arc. And specifically here, we see what's known as a somatic spinal reflex. And we'll talk about the different types of reflex arcs in just a moment. So somatic, you're familiar with the somatic nervous system, and you're just a little bit familiar with the spinal cord. We'll talk much more about the spinal cord in another recording. So let's go through this. Number 1. There's a sensory receptor in every reflex arc, at least one type of sensory receptor. Here, somebody has perhaps stepped on a tack, and that initiates sensory signals that travel along sensory neurons, number 2, toward the central nervous system. We see the site of integration is a segment of the spinal cord, and remember the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. And in the gray matter of the spinal cord, we see that sensory neuron synapses with an interneuron, and that interneuron synapses with a motor neuron. And so all of that cell-to-cell communication that occurs inside the spinal cord, that's all part of the integrative function of the nervous system, the integrating center of this reflex arc. And then the integrating center determines that action is required. And so number 4 indicates a motor neuron, and that efferent pathway leads to number 5. The effector here is skeletal muscle. So if you stepped on a tack, this somatic spinal reflex will cause you to withdraw your foot from the painful stimulus. And so the muscles that are required for you to pick your foot up and pull it away from the floor or the tack will be stimulated. And so that might involve your hamstrings, for example. Your hamstrings might contract in order to flex your leg at the knee. So there are many, many different reflexes, and as humans, we build boxes in order to understand complex things. We create categories, we give things labels. We develop criteria for identifying or classifying. And so reflexes are categorized according to 3 different criteria. The first criterion is the reflex instinctual or acquired? Where instinctual means that it's inborn. Every body was born with this reflex in place. As opposed to acquired. An acquired reflex is something that is learned. So withdrawing your hand from a hot surface, that is an instinctual reflex. The typical human body is born with that reflex. Versus if a ball is thrown at you, reaching up to catch that ball might be an acquired reflex. I think the instinctual reflex might be to duck or move out of the way. But if you have some type of sports training like baseball or softball or something that involves you catching the ball, when a ball arrives in front of your face, your acquired reflex may be to move your body in such a way that you catch that ball. All right, the second criterion is, well, where is the site of integration? Is it in the brain or is it in the spinal cord? And so cranial reflexes occur, the site of integration is in the brain and specifically in the brain stem, and we'll talk more about what that means in a little bit later. And then spinal reflexes, the site of integration is in the spinal cord. And it is important to note that neither the brain stem nor the spinal cord are responsible for your conscious awareness over what's happening. So these reflexes happen beyond your level of awareness. They will happen whether or not you recognize them. It might feel like you willed yourself to catch that ball, but the site of integration is outside your level of conscious awareness. It communicates with the parts of your brain that are responsible for conscious awareness. So it might feel like you willed yourself into doing that, but most likely it was an involuntary reflex. All right. Number 3, the third criterion is the type of motor output. So this refers to, well, what is the effector? And you remember the effectors in the nervous system, the types of cells that motor neurons can stimulate are skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. And so this gets us back to those divisions of the nervous system, particularly somatic versus autonomic. So if the effector is skeletal muscle, we call it a somatic reflex. And if the effector is smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands, we call that an autonomic reflex. So we can combine those 3 criteria to slap some labels on the various types of reflexes. So here we are again at the knee-jerk response, the knee-jerk reflex. It's a stretch reflex. And can we apply those 3 criteria and characterize the knee-jerk reflex? So, do you think this reflex is instinctual or acquired? Are most bodies born with this reflex, or is this something that a person will learn through experience? It's instinctual. Is this reflex cranial or spinal? Where is the site of integration? It's spinal. You can just look at the picture and see the segment of the spinal cord there. And so this is a spinal reflex. And what is the effector here? The effector will tell you if it's a somatic or an autonomic reflex. So the effector here is skeletal muscle. Those muscles of the quadricep cause you to extend your leg at the knee in response to that rubber mallet tapping. And so this is an instinctual, spinal, somatic reflex. While we're on this picture, please draw your attention to that segment of the spinal cord. And at the very top of the image there, do you see how one branch of that sensory neuron is sort of pointing up with an arrow that says to brain? Well, that pathway is not required for the reflex to occur. The reflex would occur whether or not that signal to the brain happens, but it is that signal to the brain that alerts you, that makes you consciously aware of, oh, something just tapped on my patellar tendon and then my leg kicked out. So you become aware of it because of that message being sent to your brain, but your brain is not at all responsible for the knee-jerk reflex. So the knee-jerk response is a particular type of reflex called a stretch reflex. And stretch reflexes are a protective mechanism. So you know that muscle is pliable, it's extensible. We can stretch our muscles, and our muscles do normally go back to their original length following stretching. Is it possible to overstretch a muscle? Sure is. Does that generally involve a painful stimulus? It sure does. So we get these painful messages that tell us, hey, this hurts, maybe you shouldn't go any further in that stretch. And that we have conscious awareness over, but we also have these subconscious reflexes that will prevent us from overstretching. So as those quadriceps are being sort of tugged on by that rubber mallet, the quadriceps will, as part of this reflex, those quadriceps will contract as a mechanism for preventing that overstretching. All right, let's characterize our next reflex. It's called the vomit reflex. And the vomit reflex can be triggered by a variety of different sensory inputs. So let's just go through those bullet points there. You have chemically sensitive cells called chemoreceptors in the fourth ventricle of the brain. And I know we haven't talked about brain structure yet, but within the brain we have these, they're called ventricles, and they are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. So this fluid that bathes the exterior and some of the interior of both the brain and the spinal cord. And this cerebral spinal fluid, it circulates, and it is constantly being manufactured by cells that filter blood to create new cerebral spinal fluid. So some of the components of cerebral spinal fluid used to be in your blood. And we have these chemically sensitive cells, these chemoreceptors in our ventricles, that can detect the presence of particular potential toxins. And so this is why certain drugs will cause vomiting. Like perhaps you're familiar with somebody who has overdone it with alcohol. That's pretty common, especially among college students. Another way that the vomit reflex can be triggered is through the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is one of the cranial nerves. It connects with the brainstem, and it actually serves a variety of tissues and organs in your thoracic and your abdominal pelvic cavity. Vagus means like vagabond, the wandering nerve. So it's a little bit all over the place, but in a very controlled way. So another stimulus that can trigger the vomit reflex is irritation of the GI tract. So let's say you ate something, like maybe, let's say you ate something that has the potential to be poisonous. Like all the time, people forage for wild mushrooms, and people who don't know what they're doing, or even people who do know what they're doing, can accidentally ingest a poisonous mushroom instead of a safe mushroom. Well, the vomit reflex can be triggered if some of the toxic molecules in that mushroom irritate the vagus nerve or irritate the lining of the GI tract, and that signal gets sent to the brainstem and to induce vomiting. So you're getting the sense that this vomit reflex has a protective mechanism, right? And then finally, there are higher brain centers. So maybe you've experienced nausea, maybe you have even vomited by disgusting sights, smells, or even anxiety can trigger the vomit reflex. So let's characterize the vomit reflex. Is it instinctual or acquired? It's instinctual. Can we develop sensitivities? Yeah, actually. So it can actually be modified through learning. Do you have any food aversions? Have you ever eaten anything and then gotten really sick afterward? Like you've vomited over and over and over again so that you'll never eat that thing again. And anytime you even see it or smell it, you start to feel nauseous. That's an extension of the vomit reflex. So we were all born with this basic instinctual vomit reflex, and then it can kind of be modified through experience, and we develop food aversions. But still, it's definitely an instinctual reflex. And then we have to think about the site of integration. Is the site of integration in the brain or in the spinal cord? And in this case, it's in the brain. It's in the brain stem. So it is a cranial reflex. And then let's think about the effector. Is it a somatic reflex or an autonomic reflex? What's the effector that brings about vomiting? We have not talked too much about smooth muscle, but the main effector there is smooth muscle. It also involves salivary glands. Have you ever noticed that before you vomit, you start to salivate, and that saliva acts as a lubricant to help move the contents of your stomach out through your mouth as a lubricant. But of course, there are skeletal muscles involved as well. You do have to open your mouth, and the superior portion of your esophagus is made out of skeletal muscle. But primarily, the effector is smooth muscle in the wall of the stomach and the wall of the duodenum and the lower esophagus. All right, so the vomit reflex is an instinctual, cranial, autonomic reflex. Hi, Stan. I don't know if you're a South Park fan. I haven't watched it in many years, but I used to think it was brilliant. And so Stan has a crush on Wendy. And every time he sees Wendy, he vomits because I guess he gets so nervous. This is an example of how higher brain centers can trigger the vomit reflex. All right. We've already been through this, but do you remember what I just said? Can you characterize the vomit reflex? Is it instinctual or acquired? It's instinctual. Where's the site of integration? Is it the brainstem or the spinal cord? It's the brainstem. And choose the best effector, somatic or autonomic. It's autonomic. So even though some skeletal muscle is involved, definitely vomiting requires the smooth muscle that is included as part of the wall of the stomach. It also involves the salivary glands. Dad, will you marry me? Ew, no, Dad. Good. We'll just keep practicing this so that when somebody actually asks you to marry them, it'll just be a knee-jerk reaction. And so this is intended to be funny, but this dad is trying to build a learned reflex. All right, so I hope you remember the major divisions of the nervous system. Fundamentally, all structures of the nervous system are divided into central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. And there are typically 3 divisions of the peripheral nervous system: the somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system. I am tabling the enteric nervous system until we get to the digestive system. So the ENS is going to sit on the back burner for a while, and we will revisit here the differences between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, and then we are going to go buck wild on the autonomic nervous system in this segment. The autonomic nervous system has 2 different types of motor output: sympathetic and parasympathetic. One form of motor output will serve to inhibit the effector, to slow that effector down, to have that effector do less of whatever that effector does, it will do less. The other form of stimulation will cause that effector to speed up or increase its activity. Whatever that effector does, it will get busier. So let's remind ourselves, what are the effectors in the somatic nervous system versus the autonomic nervous system? The effectors in the somatic nervous system, it's always skeletal muscle. It's always skeletal muscle. And the effectors in the autonomic nervous system, smooth muscle or cardiac muscle or glands. Here's a pretty complicated diagram, but you should be familiar with this organizational scheme from a previous lecture. And there is a flow of information. Notice that the nervous system is divided into central and peripheral, and then that peripheral, another way to think about that is incoming versus outgoing information, afferent versus efferent. And then within the autonomic nervous system, there are two types of efferent information. The autonomic gives rise to sympathetic or parasympathetic. And we'll talk about those handy phrases, fight or flight, and rest and digest. So we have seen probably this exact slide before. Your autonomic nervous system is responsible for subconsciously perceived visceral sensations. So the sensory input in the ANS is from your visceral organs, the walls of your blood vessels, the walls of your hollow organs, etc. And then the motor output is, as we just mentioned, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. And the motor output operates via reflexes, and these reflexes are under involuntary control. Very few people can voluntarily will their heart rate to increase or decrease. But for all of us, our heart rates increase and decrease all day long, depending on what we're thinking about, the emotions that we're experiencing, how we're moving our bodies. Are we digesting food? So that's under involuntary control. And in the autonomic nervous system, there's both parasympathetic and sympathetic stimulation. One stimulates, the other will inhibit. And two different types of motor neuron deliver each type of stimulation to the effector. So notice those effectors in the diagram there. Let's take a look at, let's look at that pancreas. And you're like, which one is the pancreas? So let's see. We have trachea and bronchi, and below that we have the heart, and below that we have the stomach and the duodenum, and below that is pancreas. So the pancreas is below the duodenum on this diagram. The pancreas is below the duodenum and above the adrenal gland. So take a look there, and we see one dotted line and one solid line. And the artist is using that to illustrate dual innervation. The dotted line, let's say, is one type of stimulation. Let's say the dotted line is sympathetic stimulation and the solid line is parasympathetic stimulation. So one stimulation along one set of motor neurons is going to stimulate or increase the activity of the pancreas, and stimulation along the other motor neuron will inhibit or decrease the activity of the pancreas. All right, so let's take a deeper dive into sympathetic and parasympathetic motor output. So they have antagonistic effects. Their effects oppose each other. Again, one will rev up the activity of the effector while the other will inhibit or slow down the activity of the effector. And all day long, sympathetic and parasympathetic are shifting. There's this constant shifting balance to govern the activity of our visceral organs. All day long, our visceral organs need to increase and decrease their activity. A little more, a little less, a little higher, a little lower, a little faster, a little slower, in order to maintain homeostasis. This table shows us, under the column heading structure, it shows us various effectors in the autonomic nervous system. And then it shows us how that effector responds to sympathetic stimulation and how that effector responds to parasympathetic stimulation. So notice that for all those structures, all of those effectors, they are made up of either smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. Let's think about the iris of the eye. The iris of the eye is made out of or includes, among other tissues, it includes smooth muscle. And in response to an increase in sympathetic stimulation, that smooth muscle changes to allow for pupil dilation. Your pupils get bigger. But in response to an increase in parasympathetic stimulation, that smooth muscle will change its behavior and create or generate pupil constriction. Your pupils will get much narrower. Salivary glands, they're obviously glands. In response to an increase in sympathetic stimulation, that decreases the production of saliva. You might even experience a dry mouth. But the opposite occurs during parasympathetic stimulation. That will increase the production of saliva, and maybe you even drool. And so we can go through each effector, and there are two important points here. Number one, for each of these effectors, the cells are smooth muscle or cardiac muscle or glands, and the effects of an increase in sympathetic stimulation are antagonistic to the effects of parasympathetic stimulation. In every case, one form of stimulation will increase the activity of the effector, and the other form of stimulation will decrease the activity of the effector. And this brings us to dual innervation. Each effector in the autonomic nervous system receives two types of motor stimulation, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And those two types of stimulation are delivered along two separate motor pathways. Different motor neurons deliver the two different types of motor stimulation. So we're looking at the iris of the eye, and the blue motor neuron is delivering parasympathetic stimulation, and the yellow motor neuron is delivering sympathetic stimulation. So anatomically, there are two different pathways for these two different forms of motor output to reach the effector. Homeostasis. I love the phrase a constant shifting balance, and your autonomic nervous system is in operation all day long, 24/7, 7 days a week. And your autonomic nervous system operates below your level of conscious awareness. And so all day long, below your level of awareness is a little more, a little less, a little higher, a little lower. And that's a general model for understanding homeostasis. The general model presented here can help us understand the conditions under which parasympathetic stimulation will increase or dominate, and the conditions under which sympathetic stimulation will increase or dominate. And those two phrases are rest and digest and fight or flight. They're catchy, right? So let's start with the sympathetic responses. And again, these sympathetic responses are constantly being dialed up or dialed down. We use that expression fight or flight, but it is not true that you have to be in, quote, fight or flight mode in order to experience an increase in sympathetic stimulation. It's just that extreme activation is what we are consciously aware of as fight or flight. So think about it. Have you ever been very afraid where you needed to either fight for your life or flee, run away for your life? You've been very afraid. There's been a significant threat, or at least you perceived a significant threat. What happens to your body under those conditions? It's late at night, you're in a dark parking garage, and there's a creepy guy walking behind you with a 2-foot lead pipe in his hand. That would put any of us in fight or flight mode. What happens to your body? You breathe heavy. Your palms start sweating. Your heart rate increases. I know you can't see it, but your pupils will dilate. So a whole suite of responses occur when we dial up sympathetic stimulation to a whole suite of effectors. And then during that time of fight or flight, you're in the parking garage, you're scared for your life. Which tissues and organs are not particularly important at that time, and so they should decrease their activities in order to, maybe allow more blood flow to the more important parts of your body like skeletal muscle. So which tissues and organs are not immediately necessary when you are about to be attacked in the dark parking garage? So your digestive system, not so important. You needing to urinate, not so important at the time. So we're getting on to sympathetic responses. Let's contrast that with parasympathetic responses. And again, I can't stress this enough. Students commonly misperceive the autonomic nervous system as really only coming online at the extremes, where the truth is all day long there's this dialing up and dialing down, this back and forth between sympathetic and parasympathetic. It is helpful for us to understand what happens during the extremes. So the extreme activation is called rest and digest. And so we are definitely not in the parking garage anymore, but we are at the end of Thanksgiving meal. So we've just had a big family and friends meal. Your belly is full. And this time you are not responsible for any cleanup. You're not responsible for watching any children or any pets or even entertaining any people. You can just lay on the couch and close your eyes if you want. You can lay on the couch and watch the sporting event if you want. So that's extreme activation that we can think of as rest and digest. So now, under these circumstances, much different circumstances, right? Which tissues and organs should increase their activities? Well, everything dedicated to digestion, yes? So there will be an increase in blood flow to the organs of your GI tract. There'll be an increase in the secretion of glands that are in the wall of your stomach, for example. And which organs and tissues are not immediately necessary and should decrease their activities. It's okay for your heart rate to slow. It's okay for your breathing to slow because you're resting. All right, so using these extremes, we can try to understand this model of fight or flight versus rest and digest. These are such goofy pictures, but so on the left, we see fight or flight, right? The guy is afraid of the tiger, and that's particularly relevant in San Francisco because many years ago, somebody at the San Francisco Zoo, I think they broke in or they did something illegal, and at least one person was mauled to death by the tiger. And so that's going to elicit extreme sympathetic arousal. There'll be an increase in sympathetic motor output, just sort of globally in your whole autonomic nervous system. And you can see that in the fight or flight response, the pupils get wide. That allows more light in to increase visual acuity. Salivation decreases. You might experience a dry mouth, and this helps prevent you from choking on your saliva. You will start to sweat. Your body will get ready to need to unload additional heat that will be generated by your skeletal muscles as you either run away or you fight. So your body already engages in cooling itself in anticipation of the boost in physical activity that will be necessary to preserve your life. Your heart rate will go up. Your rate and depth of breathing will go up. And this serves the purpose of being able to deliver more oxygen and nutrients to your skeletal muscles that are about to become very active as you either fight or run. Digestive system processes are slowed down. It is definitely not so important for you to be processing your last meal while you're fleeing for your life. And so as we'll see later on, that blood is actually diverted away from your GI tract and more blood will flow to your skeletal muscles. And then your adrenal glands are part of the sympathetic response. And you're like, but wait a minute, aren't those endocrine glands? And I'll say, yes, they are, but they're part of the neuroendocrine system, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. All right, you see that cute little kitty, and you love kitties, and kitties are very calming for you. So what happens during an increase in parasympathetic stimulation? Well, your pupils will contract, they get smaller, and maybe, I don't know, if you think kitties are really delicious, you might actually drool. But no, an increase in parasympathetic stimulation actually promotes the formation of saliva. So you definitely won't have a dry mouth. You won't be particularly sweaty. Your rate and depth of respiration will slow. Your heart rate will slow. If there's a meal in your belly, in your gut, the digestive system processes are they're happening at a high rate, and then your adrenal glands are not particularly active. So your autonomic nervous system operates according to reflex arcs. And again, these are the same 5 components of any reflex arc. We're going to apply them to autonomic nervous system reflexes. So let's think about the types of sensory receptors that are involved in autonomic nervous system reflexes. Collectively, they're called interoceptors. These are sensory receptors that pay attention to variables that occur inside your body. So they're noticing what's happening on the inside of you, not the outside of you. Some more details. Your interoceptors, or your autonomic sensory receptors, are found inside your visceral organs, so the organs of your thoracic cavity and your abdominal pelvic cavity. And here's an example of a type of interoceptor, the stretch receptors that are in the cervix, which is the inferior portion of the uterus. Those stretch receptors are absolutely paying attention to something that's happening inside the body, completely oblivious to things that are happening outside the body. Other examples, in certain blood vessels, we have chemically sensitive cells and pressure sensitive cells, chemoreceptors and baroreceptors that are monitoring your blood chemistry, what's the pH, how much carbon dioxide is present, etc., and what's your blood pressure. To what degree are those blood vessel walls stretching? So those are definitely internal conditions. And then our third example, we have interoceptors that are embedded in your central nervous system, such as osmoreceptors that occur in your hypothalamus. They're constantly monitoring the osmolarity of blood and cerebrospinal fluid. And then we have chemoreceptors in that fourth ventricle, and we just talked about those as being one form of sensory input that's important for the vomit reflex. Baroreceptors, we will end up talking about baroreceptors quite a bit because they will come up again for us in the cardiovascular system. So baroreceptors are pressure receptors, right? Like a barometer measures pressure, air pressure. So baroreceptors are these stretch-sensitive cells that occur in the walls of your aorta, your aortic arch, I should say, and your internal carotid arteries. Maybe in a previous class you learned about the carotid bodies. And so they respond to changes in blood pressure by either firing more or fewer action potentials. And so they're constantly sending information to the cardiovascular center in your brain. Well, what's blood pressure now? How about now? How about now? How about now? She just got up to take a walk and get a glass of water. What's her blood pressure now? So they're constantly monitoring blood pressure, which is a controlled condition. This is a great image. It shows you the location of the baroreceptors in the aortic arch. So the aorta is a large artery emerging from the heart. And we also have baroreceptors in the carotid bodies. So the carotid arteries, there's a right and a left, and they go up toward the brain. And they're on either side of your trachea. You could even take your carotid pulse. If you find your windpipe and you take 2 fingers and you lay it next to your windpipe, next to your trachea, you should be able to feel your carotid pulse. Well, there is a portion of each carotid artery called the carotid body, and in there we find baroreceptors. And so those baroreceptors are constantly sending signals to your brainstem. And the medulla oblongata is part of your brainstem, and that's where we find the cardiovascular center. On the left, we see a different but very similar artistic representation of the location of those baroreceptors in the aortic arch and in the carotid body. And on the right, that's the new thing that we get to introduce. On the right, we see two graphs, actually. We see arterial pressure over time, so that's pressure in an artery over time, expressed in millimeters of mercury. And then down below that, we see the firing rates of afferent neurons arising from those baroreceptors over time. So when blood pressure is normal, you can see that there is a particular firing rate. And then when blood pressure goes up, you can see that that firing rate increases dramatically. More action potentials are fired by those baroreceptors and the sensory neurons in a shorter period of time. The integration center for autonomic reflexes is always in the brain. They are all cranial reflexes, and we can even narrow that down to the brainstem or the hypothalamus. So what are we talking about when we say brainstem or hypothalamus? Let's start with the hypothalamus because we have talked about that before. The hypothalamus is the integration center for many, many, many different aspects of homeostasis. And in a very early lecture, we talked about body temperature homeostasis, and that is an autonomic reflex. And the body temperature integration center is in the hypothalamus, along with your hydration, along with your sex drive, along with your hunger, and a whole bunch of other integration sites. And then your brainstem. Your brainstem includes the three regions shown here, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And the brainstem is closest to the spinal cord. And sometimes it's described as, and I'll use air quotes around this, like the most primitive part of the brain. And that's really not a good model for looking at the brain, but I'll say that here because if you think about the brain functions that are necessary in order for you to just stay alive. Those integration centers are seated in your brainstem. So your brainstem includes your cardiovascular center, which can regulate how fast your heart beats, how hard your heart beats. Another example is your respiratory centers are housed in your brainstem. And those are the integration centers that control your rate and depth of pulmonary ventilation, your rate and depth of breathing. So here, in the context of the nervous system, we'll continue to talk about regulating heart rate, right? We started with the baroreceptors, and now we're into the integration center. The integration center is the cardiovascular center, and that is in the brainstem. More specifically, it's in the medulla oblongata. And by introducing this concept here, it will make it easier or more familiar to you when we get to the cardiovascular system. We will revisit the autonomic reflexes involved in regulating heart rate and force of contraction. So we're back to this picture. We've already talked about the baroreceptors. Those are the sensory receptors. We can see the artistic representation of the sensory or afferent neurons. And notice where all those neurons lead. They lead to the cardiovascular center, which is in the medulla oblongata. And so what is the motor output? Motor neurons carry the nerve impulses from the site of integration to the effector. And there's a little reminder there that in the autonomic nervous system, the effectors are either smooth muscle or cardiac muscle or glands. And again, there are two different sets of neurons that deliver motor output to any given effector. There are sympathetic motor neurons and parasympathetic motor neurons. On the right, we see a sagittal section of the brain with the cardiovascular center highlighted in purple. And we can look at the sensory inputs, and the sensory neurons or the pathways are highlighted in blue, and the motor outputs, the motor neurons, are highlighted in red. So let's take a look at the sensory inputs to the cardiovascular center. Let's start with what we have been talking about. So now I'm looking at the light blue panel in the upper right of this image. So we have been talking about from baroreceptors, and those are those stretch sensitive cells that respond to changes in blood pressure. But there are a variety of sensory inputs that provide information to the cardiovascular center, including those higher brain centers. Have you ever just thought yourself into having an increased heart rate? Think about something scary or something that induces anxiety, or maybe you think about somebody that you're in love with. It can cause your heart rate to increase. Proprioceptors. As your body begins to move, particularly at the onset, the very beginning of physical activity, that movement in your muscles and your joints gets transmitted to or the information about that movement gets transmitted to your cardiovascular center. So your cardiovascular center sort of gets a tip off, oh, hey, she's moving. We're going to need to increase heart rate in just a moment. And we talked about the baroreceptors, and then there are also chemoreceptors, chemically sensitive cells in those carotid bodies as well as in your brain that are monitoring various aspects of your blood chemistry. What's your blood pH? How much carbon dioxide is in your blood? How much oxygen is in your blood? And so those are important inputs into your cardiovascular center. And then your cardiovascular center is an integrating center. It combines and analyzes these various sources of input, and when necessary, it generates a response. And we're going to start by talking about motor output, the top two red lines, motor output along the vagus nerve to the heart, and motor output along cardiac accelerator nerves to the heart. And then later on, we'll talk about vasomotor nerves. So let's just think about the heart as an effector, cardiac muscle tissue. When there's an increase in parasympathetic stimulation, it is sent along the vagus nerves to the heart, and it results in a decrease in heart rate. When there is an increase in sympathetic stimulation to the heart, that information travels along cardiac accelerator nerves, and it results in an increase in heart rate as well as contractility. Contractility refers to how hard the heart beats. So if your heart beats harder, it can force more blood out with every contraction. All right, so there are two different sets of motor neurons, sympathetic and parasympathetic. In this case, parasympathetic stimulation inhibits the activity of the effector. It slows the heart down, whereas sympathetic stimulation increases the activity of the effector. It speeds up the heart and it causes the heart to beat harder. All right, let's take a look at those vasomotor nerves. So now we're thinking about a different effector entirely. We're thinking about the smooth muscle that is present in blood vessel walls. So this is not cardiac muscle, this is smooth muscle. And it turns out that your blood vessels are the only structure that I know of. Is that true? The only structure that I know of in the autonomic nervous system that does not receive dual innervation. The smooth muscle in your blood vessel walls receives sympathetic stimulation only, and that gets dialed up and dialed down all day long. And depending where we are in the body, an increase in sympathetic stimulation, in this case, can lead to vasoconstriction. So blood vessels become more narrow. So maybe these blood vessels are serving the GI tract, and you're about to run away from the guy with the pipe in the dark parking garage. So an increase in sympathetic stimulation to the blood vessels that are serving your gut, your GI tract, will result in vasoconstriction. So just to reinforce this idea of dual innervation, where the effector is innervated by two different sets of motor neurons. For the heart, parasympathetic motor output is delivered via the vagus nerve, and sympathetic motor output is delivered by cardiac accelerator nerves. Here's a way to visualize that. So on the left, you clearly see a heart. I hope you recognize that. On the right, we're looking at two different segments of the spinal cord. Oh no, we're looking at a segment of the medulla oblongata, and then down below, we're looking at a segment of the spinal cord. And again, the sensory inputs are color-coded in blue. So the afferent pathway is blue, and the efferent or the motor pathways are red. So in blue, starting with the sensory input, we see the sensory receptors, those baroreceptors, and the sensory neurons deliver sensory input to the cardiovascular center that's in the medulla oblongata. When necessary, that medulla oblongata generates motor output that travels down the brainstem, down the spinal cord, and out through a spinal nerve. In this case, we are looking at motor output along the sympathetic pathway. So we are looking at the pathway that motor, that efferent information travels as it exits the spinal cord, travels as part of a spinal nerve for a little while. It synapses in a sympathetic trunk ganglion, and then it travels the rest of the way to the heart. And so this brings us to, once again, the autonomic nervous system. The motor output travels along two different motor neurons connected in sequence. So if we look at this pathway from the spinal cord to the heart, there's motor neuron number 1, that's part of a spinal nerve. It synapses with motor neuron number 2, in this case, a sympathetic trunk ganglion. And then motor neuron number 2 delivers, in this case, sympathetic stimulation to the heart. Next level. So parasympathetic stimulation is delivered to the effector using the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. You're familiar with acetylcholine. It's the same neurotransmitter that occurs at the neuromuscular junction. But that's somatic. We're all about autonomic right now. So parasympathetic stimulation is delivered using the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is released by the postsynaptic motor neuron onto the effector. And sympathetic stimulation is delivered via a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. The postganglionic or the postsynaptic motor neuron releases norepinephrine onto the effector. So we can apply that specifically to the heart. When the vagus nerve secretes acetylcholine onto cardiac muscle cells, that's going to cause the heart rate to slow. When cardiac accelerator nerves secrete norepinephrine onto cardiac muscle, that's going to cause the heart rate to increase. All right, so we've got that black band in the middle. There are actually 3 panels in this diagram, but I only want us to look at 2 of them for now. We'll introduce the 3rd one in just a little bit. So in our top panel, we are looking at parasympathetic motor output. In general, we're not specific to the heart at this point, but we can see, and now of course to make it more confusing, the motor neuron is blue in this case. So we see the motor neuron begins in the gray matter of the spinal cord. The lateral gray horn is where the cell body of that motor neuron is. And we have a preganglionic motor neuron and we have a postganglionic motor neuron. And of course, the two synapse in a ganglion. So the preganglionic motor neuron number 1, exits the spinal cord in this case, synapses in a ganglion where it secretes acetylcholine. Motor neuron number 2 is stimulated by that and delivers an action potential to the effector. In a sympathetic pathway, that second neurotransmitter, the one that gets secreted onto the effector, is always norepinephrine. And to my eye, that looks like a salivary gland, a urinary bladder, and a heart. So those are just 3 example effectors in the autonomic nervous system. And norepinephrine will, for the salivary gland, norepinephrine will inhibit the function of the salivary gland, slow it down. In the case of the heart, norepinephrine will speed up heart rate and force of contraction. All right, let's take a look at the bottom image. In the bottom image, we are looking at parasympathetic motor output. Notice again, it's a two motor neuron pathway. There's a preganglionic motor neuron and a postganglionic motor neuron. And the preganglionic motor neuron begins in the spinal cord, in the gray matter of the spinal cord. That preganglionic motor neuron, its axon, exits the spinal cord as part of a spinal nerve, and it synapses with the postganglionic motor neuron in a ganglion. And again, the neurotransmitter that is secreted by the preganglionic motor neuron is acetylcholine. This is a parasympathetic pathway, so for the postganglionic motor neuron number 2, the neurotransmitter that is secreted onto the effector is always acetylcholine, ACH. And so, for that salivary gland and for the heart, that salivary gland will be stimulated by acetylcholine. So saliva production will increase in response to acetylcholine, in response to an increase in parasympathetic stimulation. Whereas the heart, those cardiac muscle cells, will slow down heart rate in response to acetylcholine. So let's use this image to review the following. And there's a lot of terminology there. We've covered a lot of ground so far. So interoceptors, I hope you remember that interoceptors refer to any type of sensory receptor that's monitoring some condition inside the body. So here we can think of proprioceptors, baroreceptors, and chemoreceptors. Those are all examples of interoceptors. Autonomic sensory neurons. Those are all delivering information arising in visceral organs toward the brain, either the hypothalamus or the brainstem. Here specifically, we are using as an example autonomic regulation of heart rate. So the integration center is in the brainstem, specifically the medulla oblongata, and it's called the cardiovascular center. And the cardiovascular center receives a variety of different sources of sensory input. The cardiovascular center can it can give rise to either parasympathetic stimulation or sympathetic stimulation. And in both cases, signals travel along one set of nerves or another set of nerves to the heart muscle. In the case of an increase in parasympathetic stimulation, that's delivered to the heart muscle, to cardiac muscle by vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve, the postganglionic motor neuron, will secrete acetylcholine onto the heart, and the heart rate will go down. In the case of an increase in sympathetic stimulation, that's transmitted to the heart by motor neurons that are part of the cardiac accelerator nerve. And in response to an increase in sympathetic stimulation, norepinephrine will be secreted by the postganglionic motor neuron onto the heart muscle itself, and that causes the heart to increase the rate of contraction, so heartbeat speeds up. Here's where we get to introduce that third panel, that middle panel that I had blacked out in a previous slide. It's our next layer of complexity, and it is definitely neuroendocrine, where the nervous system overlaps with the endocrine system. So your adrenal glands, you probably have 2 adrenal glands, one on top of each of your kidneys, and your adrenal glands are classically part of the endocrine system. They secrete hormones that travel in your blood. But the adrenal medulla, the interior, the deep portion of the adrenal glands, are really better classified as part of your neuroendocrine system. Here's what an adrenal gland looks like from a cadaver. And this is definitely not from a cadaver. This is a very cartoon-like representation of an adrenal gland. Your adrenal glands are really 2 glands in one. So there's an adrenal medulla, the deepest part, the interior, the inner core of the adrenal gland is the adrenal medulla. And surrounding that, the superficial layer is called the adrenal cortex. And the cortex and the medulla, they are both independent glands. They secrete different sets of hormones under different conditions. So as part of the autonomic nervous system, we're going to talk about the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal cortex is really part of the classic endocrine system. There's nothing particularly neuroendocrine about the cortex, but the medulla is definitely neuroendocrine. And we might as well just call it part of your autonomic nervous system. So your adrenal medulla is really an extension of your autonomic nervous system because the cells that make up the adrenal medulla are modified postganglionic motor neurons. And so they secrete norepinephrine, a lot of it. They secrete norepinephrine and are very closely related. They're very close in structure, norepinephrine and epinephrine. They secrete these neurohormones into the blood. So here's that middle panel that I had blacked out before, and I'll show it to you in context later. So let's just go through the pathway. We're looking at sympathetic motor output that leads to the adrenal medulla. So let's start with the motor neuron. It's motor neuron number 1, the preganglionic motor neuron. It begins in the gray matter of the spinal cord, and its axon exits the spinal cord as part of a spinal nerve, and then it synapses in a ganglion. Oh, that's not right. What do you mean, Laura? I thought the preganglionic motor neuron synapses in a ganglion with the postganglionic motor neuron. That's kind of true here, except for the follow-through. So think about the cells that make up the adrenal medulla, the chromaffin cells. They are modified postganglionic motor neurons. And so instead of having axons that travel all the way to the effector, these cells skip the trip and they just release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. And so epinephrine and norepinephrine are neurohormones. They are signaling molecules that travel in the blood that were produced by neurons. So those chromaffin cells, are they endocrine? Are they neurons? They're modified neurons. They're neuroendocrine cells that make neurohormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so this is a shortcut for your body. In response to an increase in sympathetic stimulation to the adrenal medulla, those chromaffin cells, secrete a lot of epinephrine and norepinephrine into your blood. And so now these sympathetic signaling molecules travel all over your body and can bind to any tissue that has receptors for them. It can bind to norepinephrine receptors in your heart. It can bind to norepinephrine receptors that are in the smooth muscle of blood vessels. It can bind to receptors that are in the wall of any autonomic nervous system effector. So in this way, your adrenal medulla allows your sympathetic nervous system to sort of broadcast a message body-wide, sympathetic stimulation, so many effectors can be reached via the signaling molecule norepinephrine simultaneously without having to send postganglionic motor neurons to every single effector. Here are the molecular structures of norepinephrine and epinephrine. So they are very similar in structure, but they are not identical. They bind to overlapping sets of receptors. And I hope you remember that there are receptor subtypes, where for some subtypes, norepinephrine has a higher binding affinity, and other subtypes, epinephrine has a higher binding affinity. And it just allows for more nuanced communication between the nervous system and each effector. All right, there's that middle panel that we were just discussing, and now here it is in context. We're putting the whole picture together. We're putting that whole picture together. So up top, we talked about how norepinephrine is secreted by sympathetic postganglionic motor neurons. In the middle, we talked about how norepinephrine is secreted by the adrenal medulla in sort of a sympathetic broadcast message all over the body via the blood. And then down below, we talked about how acetylcholine is secreted by parasympathetic postganglionic motor neurons. So this brings us to the end of this segment. And we did talk about topics number 1, number 2, and number 3. And where we pick up next is with the spinal cord. I'll see you there.